Good evening, everyone. I'm Andrea Green, Director of the Visiting Artists Program here at SAIC, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's Distinguished Alumni Lecture by Irene Hofmann. Established in 2006, this semi-annual series has featured talented alumni such as Paul Chan, Joe Zucker, Sanford Biggers, Iñigo Manglano-Ovalle, Tanya Bruguera, and Trevor Paglin, among others. We are delighted to have Irene Hofmann return to SAIC this week, and we are honored to have her speak through this distinguished series. I would like to thank Irene for taking the time to share her projects with us and to reflect on her time at SAIC. Tonight's lecture is presented in collaboration with SAIC's Office of Alumni Relations, and I would like to thank Melissa Wolf and Jennifer Jansen for their support of the series. I would also like to thank the Robert Lehman Foundation and the Illinois Arts Council Agency for their support of tonight's program. SAIC's Visiting Artists Program is dedicated to hosting a variety of presentations by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars each academic year to foster a greater understanding and appreciation of contemporary art. You can download podcasts of previous lectures and sign up to receive email announcements by visiting our website at saic.edu/VAP. Please join us again on October 2nd when we host a dialogue on social practice between critic Claire Bishop and curator Claire Doherty. You can find additional information about our upcoming events by visiting our website. We will have time for some questions from the audience after tonight's lecture, and our staff will have microphones circulating for your use, so please raise your hand so we can get a microphone to you. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and now I would like to welcome David Goetze, Professor and Chair of SAIC's Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism, to introduce Irene Hofmann. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's a true pleasure to welcome back Irene Hofmann to SAIC as this semester's distinguished alumni lecturer. Hofmann received her Master of Arts in Art History, Theory, and Criticism from SAIC in 1994 and is currently the Phillips Director and Chief Curator of SAIC Santa Fe, a position she's held since 2010. Now, across her career, Hofmann has fearlessly considered new formats for contemporary art and been among the first to recognize the shifts in the work of artists and art institutions. One of her first curatorial positions was at the Cranbrook Art Museum, where her projects included experimental installations that helped to establish the art world recognition of such artists as Mark Dion and Andrea Zettel. From 2001 to 2005, she was a curator at the Orange County Museum of Art in Newport Beach, California, where she co-organized the 2002 and 2004 California Biennials. From 2005 to 2010, she was executive director of the Contemporary Art Museum in Baltimore. During this time, she curated such important and risky exhibitions as Cell Phone, the first museum survey of artworks created using cell phone technologies, and Cottage Industry, an exhibition about the question of artists as entrepreneurs. Now, since coming to SAIC Santa Fe in 2010, Hofmann has been instrumental in redirecting the vision for the institution and, more importantly, challenging the status quo of the art world's fascination with biennial exhibitions. Starting this past summer, as we're going to hear, SAIC Santa Fe has reinvented the biennial format with a series of linked exhibitions that will investigate contemporary art in South and North America. Sightlines, as this new multi-year endeavor is called, aims to think about new geographic networks and differences along the full longitude of the Americas from south to north. Now, what's so fresh about this concept is the idea of using the specific geographic and cultural location of Santa Fe for its ability to act as a meeting point between South and North. Both intensely local and rigorously international, Sightlines will offer a more sustained exploration of the status of contemporary art that gives a sense of the variety of the conversations, debates, and divergences that are often lost in the art world's focus on a narrow east-west axis. It's an ambitious project that offers concrete and nuanced views of the global networks of contemporary art. Many institutions give lip service to this idea, but few have introduced such significant institutional commitment to the idea of global networks or offered such an ambitious plan for enacting it. Sightlines represents the kind of rethinking that is so needed in the climate of today's art world, and we are proud to see that one of our own is at the forefront of it. Please join me in welcoming Irene Hofmann.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, David and Andrea. Thank you for this special invitation to come back to SAIC. I'm really honored to be considered one of the school's distinguished alumni and honored by your presence here tonight, so thank you. In my talk this evening, I want to share a bit about my background and the influences that shaped my career. I'll talk a little bit about my approach to curating, share some interesting projects along the way, and I'll end by sharing more with you of the work that we're doing at SAIC Santa Fe, reimagining one of the most dominant recurring events of the contemporary art world, the Biennial. So to locate you, locate me perhaps for you in my time in Chicago, here's what it was like when I was here. I spent 2 years at the school in the early to mid-90s. I was in Chicago for approximately 5 years. Lisa Wainwright was my advisor and early fashion icon. Simon Anderson was my guide to all things Fluxus, iconoclastic, and anti-establishment. Monique Milosh was my classmate and one of my first art world pals. And the MCA and the Art Institute gave me some of my first art museum jobs. If I think back to the start of my career and the path that I ultimately took and the choices that I made, I was greatly influenced by two very different women in the art world. They were born half a century apart, and each made a very significant impact on the lives of artists. One was quietly influential in her time and is still relatively obscure. And the other was a powerful force in the contemporary art world whose short life of trouble, as she called it, was marked by fearlessness, rebellion, nerve, and passion. Together, they modeled for me a career and a life dedicated to and in the service of artists. One of those women I met and briefly worked for in New York, and the other I got to know in Chicago. So they are Mary Reynolds and Marcia Tucker. So I first heard of Mary Reynolds when I arrived in Chicago. I hope all of you know who she is. I learned she was an American who moved to Paris in the early 1920s, that she was a wildly creative bookbinder, that she knew and in many ways supported the Dadaists and the Surrealists, including having collected many of their early publications, manifestos, pamphlets, all of the printed material that defined and spread the movements throughout Europe and to the United States. I learned that Reynolds was a leader in the French resistance during the World War II German occupation of France, and that her home in Paris was a safe haven and a relay station for so many artists and writers. I also learned that she had a long and intimate relationship with Marcel Duchamp. And I learned that the Art Institute had a gallery dedicated to her and owned a collection of her book bindings, letters, and so much more. This is a photograph of Mary around 1930 taken by one of her many friends, Man Ray. So with most of the holdings of what is known as the Mary Reynolds collection housed in the Ryerson Library, I petitioned the library for research access to the collection. As a grad student here, I hope to see the collection and perhaps write my thesis on some aspect of what I might find there. I don't fault Jack Brown, but my request for access was denied. As I learned, the collection was in need of organizing, and as such was difficult to make available to researchers, let alone a first-year grad student like me. 2 years passed, I got my degree here, and I went to the Walker Art Center, and I became the one of their curatorial fellows, a position that they have every year for 1 year. And in an extraordinary 12 months, I worked on shows by Elio Odesica, Marcel Duchamp, and Bruce Nauman. I saw the inner workings of a large contemporary art museum and worked with an amazing group of curators that really showed me what it meant to curate. Right after my time at the Walker, I headed back to Chicago because that's when Jack Brown hired me, thank you, Jack, to come and organize the Mary Reynolds collection. So I finally got my chance to see what was in this collection, how the treasures found its way to Chicago, and I got a rare and intimate look at the life lived of an extraordinary group of artists at a time of great turmoil and revolution in art and in the world. So during my time working at the Art Institute, I sorted through first edition books by the Surrealist writers who signed their books to Mary. I pored over photographs like the one I showed you of Mary by Man Ray, paintings and sculptures by Dali, Calder, Breton, and many others. These were all gifts to Mary for her generosity and for her warmth, is what I read so often about how she was with this group of artists. I also handled her amazing book bindings, really inspired by the Surrealists. These are all objects that you can find over at the Art Institute, in the Art Institute's galleries. Here's another couple of images of some of her bindings. I also studied the Dadaist and Surrealist journals. These manifestos, magazines, and pamphlets that she saved in her home in Paris, and that really tell the story of the spread of these movements. I also worked on creating the finding guide for the library archives, and then I read over so many letters, many of them by Duchamp. And this is where it was revealed, this part of Mary's life that she shared with Duchamp for over 25 years. This is a photograph of Brancusi, Duchamp, and Reynolds in France in 1929. So after Mary's death in 1950, Duchamp, he was the executor of her estate. He sorted through all of her belongings, all of her book bindings, all of her letters, and he gave them to Brooks Hubachek. Brooks was a Chicago attorney. He was a trustee at the Art Institute, and he was also the lawyer who helped Duchamp with his visa to come to this country. So it was a gift to him in honor of Mary, which they discussed for many years and decided that the proper home for all of these incredible objects would be the Art Institute. I showed you this earlier. This is a book plate that appears in many of her materials, and it was designed by Marcel Duchamp. So it was working with the Mary Reynolds collection, and in particular reading all of those letters, that sparked in me a great passion for research. But even more so, it made it clear to me that I was really not meant to stay in an archive. I really wanted to be at that very generative moment that Duchamp and others referenced in those letters. I wanted to know and support artists as Mary had, and I wanted to be part of whatever the next big thing in art might be. And so I knew I wanted to work with living artists. So that brings me to my other big influence, Marcia Tucker. This is Marcia in about the early 1970s. So when Mary Reynolds died in 1950, Marcia Tucker was coming of age in New York. While getting a master's at NYU in the 1960s, she supported herself taking work as a secretary at MoMA, working at Art News, and cataloging the collections of wealthy art patrons. In 1969, she became a curator of painting and sculpture at the Whitney, where she worked for almost a decade. She almost immediately helped point the museum in a very new direction. Her shows included surveys of the painters James Rosenquist, Joan Mitchell, Al Held, and the post-minimalists Robert Morris, Bruce Nauman, and infamously Richard Tuttle. It was the harsh reviews of her Richard Tuttle show that led to her dismissal from the Whitney in 1977. So leaving the Whitney, she decided to start her own museum. So it was 1977. You're looking at an image of the first new museum exhibition. This is C-Space in Tribeca, and after assembling a board and with the support of Vera List, she started the new museum. And so there's an image of Marcia in the offices, 1980s, and the Broadway entrance of the new museum, of course, before it moved to its current new home on Bowery. At the new museum, she really championed artists that weren't finding a voice in so many other New York museums. Women, artists of color, artists dealing with very urgent issues of the time, specifically things related to race, related to AIDS. She was really fearless. So, well, we'll go back. So I met Marcia while I was still an undergrad. I was studying art history at Washington University. I was home for a summer, and for just 3 months, I was her intern. I opened her mail, I sorted her calendar, I ran errands, nothing really, but I soaked in everything that I saw. It was 1990, and on view at the new museum was an extraordinary show called The Decade Show, and it was a very raucous, multi-venue exhibition that looked back at the art of the 1980s. Watching Marcia give tours of this show, watching her run her museum, and work with artists was, for me, really the spark that led me to where I am today. Like Mary Reynolds before her, she was really at the epicenter of something really extraordinary. So back to me in the archives of the Art Institute. Once I was really clear that I wanted to forge a career working with contemporary artists, I landed my first curator position at Cranbrook Art Museum. This is a very beautiful museum designed by, there it is, Eliel Saarinen in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and right across the street from Cranbrook Academy of Art. So, although by the time I got to Cranbrook, I had already worked at the Art Institute here, I'd worked at the MCA when it was still on East Ontario, I'd worked at the Walker, I'd worked 3 months at the new museum, but I still had not had my own program to direct. I still did not have a curator title yet. So this was really my first role as a curator within an institution. And it was a moment when Cranbrook was really interested in trying to begin and build a contemporary art program. The collection at Cranbrook is really quite extraordinary. It tells the story of design in America. Drawings by Eliel Saarinen, furniture by Eero Saarinen, Loya and Pipson Saarinen, the weavings by them, paintings by them, Bertoya, Florence Knoll. The whole story of design sort of at mid-century comes to life in the collection at Cranbrook Art Museum. And so I spent 3 years there with that kind of collection as a backdrop to really begin a contemporary art program that was in dialogue with the amazing graduate program that was taking place right across the street. So I curated 15 shows a year. It was an unrelenting kind of pace. I was really in overdrive to establish myself, to gain support for artists and new projects. I learned how to ask for money for the first time, and got to work with some really extraordinary artists that trusted me to work with them, because what we ended up doing together was doing a lot of brand new works, engaging with the context of Cranbrook at some times, and certainly in dialogue with a community that was really hungry for contemporary art. So some of the artists I worked with included Mark Dion. There's a wonderful science museum right around the corner from the art museum. And in the basement, Mark found a herpetology collection, all of these salamanders and lizards and turtles in formaldehyde, totally old school, that he brought out of the basement and into the museum on these beautifully, dramatically lit tables. Gregory Green. We did a pirate radio station broadcast from the top of our Saarinen building. I don't know if anyone in Bloomfield Hills knew what we were really doing. Here he is working on a project that he calls Gregnik, part of the satellite broadcast station. I worked with Andrea Zettel. This is her chicken breeding unit that I brought to Cranbrook. I worked with Bill Viola, Tacita Dean, Joseph Grigely, and the last project that I installed before leaving Cranbrook was a show of several video installations by Iñigo Manglano-Ovalle. At Cranbrook, there was really great freedom and an audience that really craved a very high level of discourse. And so that's really where I was able to define my voice as a curator. I was able to take risks and really find my way. And I really found myself drawn to works that combine aesthetics with content that expresses important issues of our time. So my next move was to Southern California, which is where I grew up, and to work for Elizabeth Armstrong. That's when I moved to the Orange County Museum of Art. Elizabeth Armstrong and I had met 8 years earlier when I was her curatorial assistant at the Walker Art Center. At that time, she was then deputy director of Orange County, and I joined her as the curator of contemporary art. So moving from Cranbrook, a very idyllic kind of setting, to a place like Orange County was the first time I really started to understand the necessity of a curator to really be responsive to institution, to community, and to context. So this is the Orange County Museum of Art, right across from Fashion Island. So let me go back to that, it's much better. So it's full Orange County. The shopping center right across the street, one of the most lucrative BMW dealers right around the corner. It was a totally different kind of context. I missed the students at the academy. I had a very different kind of audience and a more populist kind of program in this museum. Nonetheless, there was great possibility in Orange County for me to have a larger audience, greater support for what I was doing, but it was also a lot more rigid and challenging for me to find a way to really take chances. The Orange County Museum of Art used to be known as the Newport Harbor Art Museum, and attached to those years was a lot of great experimentation. It was the Newport Harbor Art Museum that gave Chris Burden an early show. It was the curator of the Newport Harbor Art Museum, Phyllis Lujan, who was taken hostage at knife point by Chris in Orange County. So it was an interesting time in the early days of the Orange County Museum of Art, but it was much more challenging and conservative by the time I arrived. But it had a history of biennials. They had been known as the Newport Biennial. One year it was focusing on the Bay Area. And with Liz and I arriving at the Orange County Museum of Art, we really wanted to change the history of biennials that were no longer feeling particularly relevant. And we started what we then called the California Biennial, sort of claiming the territory for Orange County. And it was an amazing time that the California Biennial had had 4 or 5 iterations. I worked on 2, and partially on one, and it really got me into the studios of artists throughout the state. And it was really one of the most exciting parts of being in California at that time, when really California, LA in particular, was really starting to emerge and become much more relevant. So many of the galleries that we know now as very established were still in the early sort of formative, almost the size of just a garage kind of spaces during that period. So, but I still found ways to try to be a little subversive, but I'm not sure if it was even understood. For example, I brought the Slovenian artist Marjetica Potrč to Orange County, and she makes work that shows us beauty in some of the most desperate situations on the globe. Housing, basic needs such as water. She looks for the beauty in design, that it often comes out of grave situations and out of necessity. So you're looking at a picture of a product. She didn't design it, but she brings it into the museum context. It's called a hippo roller. And it was designed to transport water in places where water often requires a half a day's journey and carrying water on your head. It's also critical and used now in places where landmines are still present. So a hippo roller allows someone to transport a large amount of water, and if they would trip a landmine, that water, what they're rolling in front of them, absorbs most of that blast. So it's this extraordinary invention that I bring into the gallery by inviting Marjetica into this exhibition. So the invitation included creating a new work, and for her that is often looking at the architecture of that place. And she speaks of gated communities and shanty towns as being the two fastest growing forms of housing in the world. And we're sitting in the middle of a land of nothing but gated communities. And so to bring an artist into our space to really talk about the other experience, the shanty town, was quite extraordinary. And so we built this amazing structure with recycled materials, all speaking of some of the influences that she saw in architecture not that far from Newport Beach. And so it's really work that celebrates the resourcefulness and creativity of initiatives that challenge the ownership of land and the planned structure of a city. And there aren't many places that I've been that are more planned and structured than Orange County. So from Orange County, I moved to Baltimore. And that perhaps was the most jarring shift for me. It was not only jarring because of where I was going, but I also was making a shift from curator to a director-curator. I took a job as the director of the Contemporary Museum, a very small museum that at that point had about a 15-year history of really bold exhibitions in spaces in and around Baltimore. I saw Marcia Tucker shortly after my departure from Orange County was announced and before I left for Baltimore. It was really just a few months before she died, and I was able to tell her of my new job and really express to her the importance of her influence. So that was the storefront of the Contemporary Museum. I was director, curator, and almost anything else that we needed. I had 3 staff members, and we worked in a 2,500 square foot gallery space, but really tried to spread out as much as we could throughout the city. Of course, this was radically different in context, in support. Orange County was completely squeaky clean, and I have a very strong memory of my first week in Baltimore picking up hypodermic needles out in front of my museum. And it was very clear to me that the kinds of exhibitions that we were staging in Orange County did not have a place in this museum in Baltimore, and that I needed to really think about where I was in the world, who my audience was, and again realize the importance of being the right curator for that institution at that time. I was also finding myself in an alternative space, and so excited about the role that an institution like this could have and should have in a larger ecosystem. And so, the Contemporary Museum emerged when curators, artists, and others in the field really began to question the traditional museum forms of exhibitions, of education, of content. In Baltimore, like many cities in the United States, we had an established encyclopedic museum, but no venue really for introducing radically new forms of contemporary art. Of course, there were many spaces nationally that were forming around the same time. When I was here in Chicago, it was spaces like NAME and Randolph Street Gallery that were really important in bringing voices that didn't have a venue elsewhere. These kinds of spaces also appropriated the grassroots strategies of activism and progressive political movements. So there was something really exciting about being in an institution that felt much more connected with what was going on in the world. While I was there, my program was really guided by a belief in the power of art to create inspiring personal experiences, to foster social progress, and to help revitalize a community, even if it were in very small ways. So some of the projects that I worked on in Baltimore include bringing Fritz Haeg and his Edible Estates project. This is a project that began in 2000, and he calls it a practical food producing initiative, a place-responsive landscaping design proposal, a conceptual land art project, and a community outreach program, and an act of radical gardening. So if you don't know what he does, he rips up your front lawn and plants an edible garden. And what happens around that process is an extraordinary exchange in a community. Our call for front lawns in Baltimore was amazing. We got videos, letters, photographs, pleading phone calls, and we finally selected this couple in Baltimore. That's Clarence and his wife. And that's day one of our project when all of the materials were arriving. That's Fritz on the path there with the hat, Clarence in front of him, my board chair in the dirt in the back, neighbors, friends. It was an amazing process over the course of a weekend. Everyone wanted to know what was going on in the front lawn. The neighbor started mowing his lawn as if to say, well, if you're going to take care of your front yard, I will too. I think what was lost on him was this was a statement against having a front lawn at all. That's the day we finished our celebration with the family, and 2 months later, I visited Clarence every season for several years. That was, I think, probably the second year of this amazing garden. When we were done, when Fritz left, when the Contemporary Museum staff left, this was his garden, and ended up on the cover of the second volume of Fritz's Edible Estates project. his book. So there we are. This is a common site in Baltimore, the abandoned row house. And the abandoned row houses near the Contemporary Museum became the material for future farmers. I invited them to come and do a new project. It was right before the economic crash. It's late 2008. I get a call from Amy Franceschini, and she says, Irene, I'm worried that you might not have any more money for our project. We have an idea that will cost nothing. And they were right. We ended up creating a project from reclaimed, recycled, or abandoned materials throughout Baltimore. This was slightly unauthorized. You can see the team cut out an oar out of the floor of an abandoned row house. They turned my museum into an active school and a place where we had many conversations around water conservation. They turned the museum into an ark. This was the reverse ark. Then I invited Joseph Grigely to do a project at the Contemporary Museum. And one of the great joys of my job is to engage with an artist with an invitation to make a new project. And an extraordinary new project was proposed to me by Joseph. He asked if I could find a choir. The choir that I found for him was the Baltimore Choral Arts Society. And together we worked on a project called Saint Cecilia. And we recorded a video, one that I hope you have seen. It was at the MCA a couple of years ago. The exhibition that we created in Baltimore came here to Chicago not that long ago. But in this project, we recorded the Choral Art Society singing beloved Christmas carols. They sang them once with the lyrics that we all know very well. Then they sang them again with lyrics that sounded very different, were quite funny, but that reflected misremembering of lyrics, perhaps, the slippages of memory, and also the difficulties of reading lips, all come together in this project. You can see how the two sides came together of these two elements of the video, how they came together side by side, and really tricked our audience as they stood there and listened to two tracks playing simultaneously, one with real lyrics that we know, the other with new lyrics, but both looking very similar on the lips. So Saint Cecilia really spoke about sort of the challenges of everyday communication and the challenges of memory. Lisa Ann Arbach was one of the last projects I worked on at the Contemporary Museum. She had a project in mind that needed an abandoned storefront. This was the Tract House, a long vacant property right around the corner from the Contemporary Museum, where we set up a room where you could come in and take away small pamphlets. These were small pamphlets like religious tracts, available to take and distribute and share. But they were all written and designed by artists. So it was a little confounding in our neighborhood to have this store where everything was free and it was about an exchange of ideas rather than money. So here were some of the tracts from the Tract House. There's Lisa on the first day when the Tract House opened. And finally, a project that took place over many years in Baltimore, a project with Dawood Bey and a group of high school students from around the city. The Walters Art Museum is right next to the Contemporary Museum, or where the Contemporary Museum was. And we worked together to do an exhibition of portraits. It combined Dawood's own portraits with extraordinary portraits from the collection in pairings that brought out really beautiful details of each. And so what you're seeing here is the installation by Dawood and this group of about a dozen teenagers in the galleries at the Walters Art Museum. So that brings me to SAIC Santa Fe. So I was at the Contemporary Museum for 5 years. And that's when I was hired by SAIC Santa Fe, again in a position to be director and chief curator, at a time of a pretty dramatic transition for SAIC. For these kinds of smaller institutions, a leadership change can be very disruptive. It is also an opportunity for change and sometimes important redirection. The mission of the Contemporary Museum and the mission of SAIC were very similar. And so while so much about my institution changed by moving to SAIC, at the heart they were very similar, had a similar kind of desire to explore and create opportunities for artists, similar kind of flexibility, and a similar kind of openness to taking risks. So this is SAIC Santa Fe, a former beer warehouse, 25,000 square feet. I go from 2,500 square feet to 25,000 square feet of exhibition space, pretty raw still, concrete floors that we can do nearly anything to, and big open spaces. Santa Fe is not, or rather was not really known for contemporary art until SAIC came along almost 20 years ago now. And it came on the scene as the host of a biennial, which was pretty bold at the time, and it really sparked a contemporary art community in Santa Fe. So I arrive as SAIC is almost 15 years old, and at a moment when biennials really were having an incredible expansion across the globe. When SAIC was founded, there were really only a handful of biennials anywhere in the world. And so SAIC Santa Fe, going to see the exhibition, there was a kind of urgency around that. And of course now there are hundreds of biennials around the world. Once SAIC was founded, it became almost overnight a year-round exhibition space, a year-round contemporary art space. But so many people didn't know it as anything other than a biennial. And so as I arrived, really studying the biennial was critical, challenging. Its existence at this institution was an important thing for us to do as an institution. And so I spent my first few years at SAIC really challenging everything we'd done before. I think it's something that's really healthy for institutions like mine to constantly examine how we do things and explore potential new ways to approach the work we're doing. But this was pretty radical to put on the table the idea that we might not do this anymore, we might not put on a biennial. So I suspended SAIC's biennial for a cycle. It was critical for us to take time to really think about what we were doing and ask really important questions. We needed to ask ourselves what the purpose of the biennial was. What was its character? What was its structure? Who is the audience? And we really chose to confront these issues head on. And so in the period during which behind the scenes we really had this important conversation, I had to really show what this institution was without a biennial. And so what you see here is the entrance to the museum during an exhibition called More Real, Art in the Age of Truthiness. And if you watch Stephen Colbert in his first year, you know this was his word, truthiness. And it permeated so many artworks of that moment and came together in an exhibition that was incredibly ambitious. It included so many major new works that looked at this sort of slippage between fact and fiction. This was an exhibition that SAIC staged in collaboration with the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and again reunited me with Elizabeth Armstrong. I was her intern at the Walker. She hired me then at the Orange County Museum of Art, and she and I curated this exhibition. She newly arriving at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and me just in my first year at SAIC. And so together we were really able to do more together than either of our institutions could have done alone. So that kept my audience excited with what we were doing and bought critical time as we really thought further about what was going to happen with SAIC's biennial. Give you a sense of some of the kind of projects that we did in the interim. Mungo Thomson, an invitation to him, created this amazing accordion sculpture that actually was an accordion. Enrique Martínez Celaya, a project where he took over the entire building in this extraordinary narrative that moved you and water through the entire building, culminating in a pond that we dug into our foundation. I know you've seen this picture. It was in some of the materials for tonight's talk, so I had to tell you about what this was all about. So all of this work went on while we were really thinking about what to do with SAIC's biennial. And early on, when I arrived in Santa Fe, I knew where I wanted to take this show, but I knew it was going to take time to get us all there. Early on, in living in Santa Fe, driving along Highway 25, I see the sign for the Pan American Highway. So it was a pretty clear moment for me, realizing that Santa Fe sits nearly on the Pan American Highway, this road that connects Santa Fe with so many thousands of miles from Alaska in the north to Tierra del Fuego in the south. And that this road, for me, had this amazing sort of romance around it, and this sense of SAIC's and Santa Fe's connectivity to the Americas. And so that began a larger conversation and a larger study of the place I was living, and realizing that the land there was once a Spanish kingdom. It was a Mexican province. It was a U.S. territory all before statehood, and that the population in Santa Fe reflects each of those levels of history still in the population, still quite strong in the population, and that essentially I was living in a place that was a microcosm of the history of the Americas. And what better place then to stage a contemporary art biennial from Santa Fe that would revisit that territory, switch the axis of the art world, which is so often east-west, to one that was north-south. And so I brought together curators from all over the world, 2 generations of curators. It included curators like Rosa Martinez, who was the curator of SAIC's 3rd biennial. It included Gerald McMaster, who was in SAIC's 1st biennial as an artist, but had just finished the Sydney Biennial as a curator. It included curators who have curated in the United States and abroad in all the major biennials you can think of. And I brought them to my house privately for 3 amazing days 2 years ago to really talk about what was going on with biennials. And for us at SAIC, we were astounded to hear so many of the issues we saw with biennials echoed by our colleagues from all over the world. We felt that through our conversation, we had arrived at sort of a roadmap for a new way of creating these exhibitions, one that would connect more with our communities and one that would be more meaningful for audiences and for artists. So, in very concrete terms, what emerged from our discussions was an expression of a desire to have greater meaning to our exhibitions, to rethink the roles of the curators of exhibitions, a greater institutional infrastructure for these exhibitions, and to create a structure for our show that could be continually refreshed. We asked this group to really think about this notion of a biennial focused on the Americas. We talked about what Pan-American means. We talked about that word. All of my North American colleagues thought this was a really dynamic term, could be a great title for our show, and every one of my Latin American colleagues said, please don't do that. We learned so much about what we don't know about each other. I heard from my Native American curatorial colleagues in the room about how we were misunderstanding maps, and that maps for them were so very different than those that we were talking about. So in our own misunderstandings with each other and misunderstandings of each other's cultures, I think we all realized the excitement and potential of this project. We talked a lot about parachuting curators dropping into a place they don't know with very little time to produce a show that so often disconnects with the community and at worst can be insulting to the community. Rosa Martinez, we talked to her a good bit about this. The 3rd day of the opening of her show, 2 of the artworks that she installed outside of SAIC's building had to be taken down because they insulted the very community she tried to engage. So we talked about the dangers of curators not understanding the place in which they curate. We talked about whether curators would be willing to move to the place that they have been invited to guest curate a biennial. And would SAIC require that? We talked about parachuting artists, same problem. Artists that are invited to come to a place, make work in response to that place, and SAIC has seen how so often that fails. I'm sure you've seen it too in biennials all over the world, where the context of that place, the history, is too tempting perhaps not to address, but without the proper time and funding for a project, they often really fall short and can insult the very communities that they often engage. So this led to what we now call sightlines. New perspectives on art of the Americas. We even move away from calling it the SAIC Santa Fe International Biennial. Our commitment now with this exhibition is all the material that we put out there says for the next 6 years, the next 3 biennials, I wanted to be sure I had the commitment of my board and my community to have 3 in this series. But I really do believe that after we finish the show in 2018, it will be very clear that this is what SAIC does, that we have created the necessary network throughout the Americas, that we really do become expert in this important region. So here's the title of our first show, Unsettled Landscapes. We crafted a structure for organizing the show with 4 curators. Candace Hopkins, she was working in Ottawa when we first met her. She now lives in Albuquerque. She is First Nations. Lucia San Ramon, she was living in Boston when I first met her, now is back in Mexico City. She moved to Santa Fe for most of our planning. Janet Dees, the curator at SAIC Santa Fe, and myself, with 2 curators embedded in the institution, it really allowed so much of our process to be much more structured. That's our team. We then created a structure of advisors. 5 additional curators who are experts in a particular region, Canada, the Caribbean, South America, and they really lent advice throughout our process. So we no longer had a singular voice. We asked our curators to spend as much time in Santa Fe as possible. We also didn't invite artists to make work in response to the place unless they were themselves willing to spend deep time and really understand the place. We even invited one artist to begin his project for this show, but it's an open-ended project. It might have a component in the 2014 biennial at SAIC and the 2016 and the 2018. So this sort of open-endedness of certain projects to allow for longer-term research. I'll show you a little bit about that. 45 artists, 15 countries, 2 generations of artists are in this show. So with Unsettled Landscapes, we are really building connections from Santa Fe to the rest of the Americas. And we're really interested in starting this series with the land. And if you've ever been to Santa Fe and know the kind of galleries that dominate in Santa Fe, landscape painting really dominates. The land, the light. You can see why so many artists have found their way to Santa Fe because of those qualities and the incredible quality of life that is there. But it also allowed us to really poke at that. Unsettled landscapes, looking really at the urgencies, the political conditions, and the historical narratives that inform artists from, as we have been saying, Nunavut in the north, and one of our curators did in fact go there, to Tierra del Fuego in the south. And so our territory is really half the globe, but one that has so many art centers that so rarely get attention from museums, from biennials in the United States. So the 3 themes that are really articulated in this exhibition are landscape, territory, and trade. And so landscape is really images of the land. Landscape is not neutral, as we argue in this exhibition. It's about travel across the land. Territory looks at borders, resources, land use. And then trade looks at the movement of goods and people, exchange and economies of the land. So let me show you a couple of images in the show. Andrea Bowers, a tree that she has created from climbing rope and parts of a group of sycamore and oak trees that she tried to save by climbing into them and living in the trees along with a number of activists in Los Angeles when this group of trees was scheduled for clear cut. They were taken down, she was arrested, but she returned to the site after the tree was gone and took the parts of the tree that you see here in this amazing sculpture and then used the ropes to create this homage. Miller Lagos from Bogota. This piece is called The Great Tree. It is inspired by a myth in the Amazon of a great ceiba tree that, as the legend goes, fell. And as it fell, it created the Amazon River. The leaves created lakes, the branches, tributaries. And so he's made what is a 14-foot tall tree, completely out of recycled newspaper. Began with 4 tons of paper donated by the local newspaper and 2 months of working in the space, stacking the paper and carving it. And if we were standing in front of this piece together, I would walk up to it and lift up a part of the tree and show you that there's absolutely no glue. It is all just stacked paper that he has cut and carved. This is from the process of putting that together. In the background is actually another ceiba tree by Johanna Kaye, also from Colombia. An image that she created all by using an old typewriter and transcribing a whole series of laws related to the ownership of land. There's a view from the gallery, and in the foreground you see a water pump. I invited Iñigo Manglano-Ovalle to be in this exhibition and to do a new piece. And what he proposed was to drill a well for water. That was his idea. And in Santa Fe, water rights are a very big deal. One cannot puncture the aquifer in Santa Fe. And so that was really out of the question. But that began a conversation about why he wanted to do this, where he might do this, and the gesture behind it. For him, it was twofold. One was the gesture of an artist drawing a line. In this case, a 140-foot line into the earth. The other was a gesture of a gift economy, and that meaning that whoever's land this pump would be on would own the sculpture, would own the pump. And so we began a conversation with a family that lives on Pueblo land. So Native American land where the laws governing the use of that land are very different. Permits for a well are not required, but permission from the family. And so we drilled a well. We drilled a well over the course of several days. about an hour north of Santa Fe. And the idea was that this well would help a family that before the well arrived, the only way they got water for crops is through acequias. And the acequias are hundreds of year old in New Mexico that bring water through communities. And in her case, in the case of this family, of Rose's family, 1 hour a week the water was released to their property for their crops. So in the end, they now have an amazing well that is great water and can help them with their crops. So there we are drilling. Major storm was just 5 minutes behind this photograph. There's Iñigo on the day that the pump was installed and water first came out. And there's the installation. So the twin of the pump out in the landscape comes into the gallery. A portrait of the amazing rig hangs on the wall, and bottles of water from the pueblo are now in our gallery. So the moment he finished the project, the sculpture became the property of Rose Simpson. There she is. I thought you guys would like this. Rose Simpson and her family. And they in turn gave back to our audience at SAIC water. So in the galleries, our guides in the galleries offer water back to the audience. Kent Monkman also looks at landscape. He's from Toronto First Nations. He will look at landscapes that have depicted Native Americans, that have depicted the West, and really starts to dismantle them using humor and a very savvy look at art history. So in this large-scale diorama, the painted backdrop, the whole thing to look a lot like a museum presentation of a diorama, where the Native American is shown in action, right? Hunting bison or whatever. This is a likeness of Kent, dressed as his alter ego, Mischief Eagle Testicle. She's got pink arrows, amazing thigh-high boots, and a dream catcher bra. And she has just slain Picasso's bull from Guernica. There are several bulls in the painted landscape that reference Picasso, and there is a bicycle seat with handlebars, also a reference to Picasso, lying on the ground next to this coyote. Quite an engaging piece to see, and one that, of course, also references another massacre that happened throughout the West of Native people. Juan Downey takes us to the section of the show that really looks at territory and traveling the Americas. This is a piece from the 1970s. We really gave ourselves permission to look back in art history to some of the pieces that we felt were really critical to this conversation. He traveled the length of the Americas from New York to Chile over 3 trips in the 1970s, and this piece, Video Transaméricas, has 13 videos along the way from these various points. Pablo Helguera created a piece that looked back at the time when New Mexico was Mexico, and there were illegal gambling dens throughout Santa Fe. Marcos Ramirez Ere and David Taylor created a project that looked back at the 1821 border between Mexico and the Western territories of the US. This is the two of them reading that treaty. They then traveled 3,000 miles to the original border with Mexico and put up monuments along the way. Shocked a lot of people in Colorado and Wyoming when they told them that they are standing on land that was once Mexico. Jason Middlebrook talks about trade through his work in this large shipping container that he's turned into your general store where everything inside is available only for barter. So you have to exchange. If you want that amazing birdhouse in the container, you have to make your own and negotiate with my staff. And finally, Blue Curry from the Bahamas, who created a piece for us that included this flagpole in the front of our building. Inside the lobby of SAIC is a video that shows you what Nassau Harbor looks like at any given moment, a place where the landscape of the Bahamas is completely transformed when a cruise ship comes into the harbor. Every time a ship comes into the harbor, we raise a flag for that ship. They're not just any flags, though. Each ship that will be coming into the harbor over the course of our show has a special flag that he made out of beach towels. Luckily, cruise ships don't move that quickly, so my staff only has to change the flags maybe once or twice a day. And so that is SAIC Santa Fe. That is our current project, Unsettled Landscapes. I brought a catalog for your library that I'd love for you to have. And the show is open until the middle of January, so if any of you find yourselves west, I hope you'll come and see me. I thank you all for coming and for this wonderful invitation. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? We do? Okay. Am I on? All right. So, does anyone have any questions for me? Hi.
Hi. Really blown away and inspired of this. I just wonder, how do you choose the artist? They seem very socio-political, and I really like. Sorry.
You're wondering how I choose the artist to work with?
Yeah, how do you find them? Because I mean, from Baltimore, looking at that, which is really incredible and so community-based, as well going down to Santa Fe, working with a different
Sure.
family. It's incredible. So how do you do research? How do you get in touch with them? How do you find them? Do they come to you?
Sure. Well, I would say that so many different ways. I am always looking at art. Many of the projects that you see here are projects with artists that I've known for many years. I will often follow an artist for 5 or 10 years before I might invite them to do a major project. That is really the case with so many of the artists. So I might meet someone in a studio where there's no project in mind, but follow the work over time. Part of what I'm doing is commissioning new work. That's a lot of what happens at SAIC. And the relationship is critical, and really trusting that the artist really will deliver something that we can work with, that I can work with them. So a lot of it is about developing a relationship with that artist and following the work over time. And making decisions, thank you, making decisions based on my institution at that time. Yeah, thank you. Hi.
Hi. Okay. You have been already addressing this in your talk in regards to how the dialogue with the site is often compensated because of lack of time or engagement.
Yeah, right.
You have been traveling a lot, and you have been visiting different spaces and museums with completely different histories, and the specificity of each site has been different. How have you been adapting yourself to the new space? What is, I guess, my question is, what has been the most urgent issue for you to kind of address initially when you arrived to a place?
Probably listening to people. Trying to understand where I am, the community, the history of the place. So much is there, you just have to find it and listen. And so a lot of what I learned about Baltimore, Site Santa Fe, I learned from the people who have lived there all their lives. And so that has been critical for me each time I've made a move to understand the place. And that has led me to develop an understanding of that place and to begin to develop a program. So.
You spoke about creating a greater depth of meaning in the show, specifically in Santa Fe.
Yeah.
And your, as you're just speaking about now, the research and the amount of attention that you're giving to the community. I know that this is really early on in the project, right? This is the first year that
right.
the biennial is happening. But have you seen any, like, what's the method for gauging that depth of meaning? I mean, I guess as a museum, you can look at attendance records or like qualitative information, but is there more, or quantitative rather, is there a more qualitative way that you are trying to get in touch with the meaning in the community?
Yes. I do. Obviously, we think about that a lot, and so I hear feedback from a number of different sources. I hear feedback from people who live in Santa Fe who've seen the entire arc of my institution's history. I have people responding to the show that have seen biennials all over the world. This is a very tightly curated show with a very specific point of view for curators, but a very specific point of view. And that is coming across, that is appreciated, that level of attention to the show has been noticed is really helpful for us to know that it's meaningful for our audience. The artists, both in the show and in our community, have been the other really interesting gauge for us. A lot of the artists in our show have been in exhibitions in many places in the world. But for so many of them, they've been in Latin American shows. They've been in shows, Caribbean artist shows. They've been in Native American shows, always sort of separated and qualified by this title, by where they live. And for so many of them, this was incredibly meaningful. This wasn't about checking off boxes or separating any of these artists, but it did bring together so many artists that have never shown together, that have never been shown in the United States. And that is something we're really committed to. But hearing it back from the artists in the show and in our community, that's a really important contribution that we can make that encourages us greatly. There's one in the back.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you would tell the story of the pieces that insulted the community and how you handled that.
Well, I wasn't the director. Rosa Martinez curated SAIC's third biennial. It was called Looking for a Place. And to her credit, she wanted to create an exhibition that engaged the history of Santa Fe.
One artist created a very large floating snake sculpture in a lake on one of the Indian reservations. She had talked to the governor of that pueblo about this project, but when this snake, which is a sacred form, showed up in the lake, it wasn't anything that they expected and was a complete insult to the people there. So while she had certainly spoken to them on some level, clearly there wasn't enough communication. And so we talked to Rosa about that. Now, 10 years later, about the impact of that and what might have been done differently, what she would have done differently. The other project was a very similar kind of thing. It was in a Catholic cemetery, and again, the piece that was installed in the cemetery had to be taken down that first weekend. But these were important lessons, I think, for SAIC to learn, for Rosa, and I think those kinds of outcomes of projects played out in biennials all over the world for so many years. So we really wanted to give our curators and our artists a different level of support and time for research so those kinds of things wouldn't happen. There's one here.
This kind of ties in part with the very first question that was asked about how you choose artists to take part in your biennials. And it kind of goes across the board in museum institution. How does the artist, or how do you determine what goes into the show, whether it's something that was formerly shown somewhere else, or do they create a proposal to present something new based on their research of the topic or whatever?
Well, in the case of Unsettled Landscapes, there were 4 curators. We coalesced around the themes: unsettled landscapes, landscape, territory, and trade. We wrote about each of those, and we each came up with our own list of artists and specific artworks that we might want in the show. And in the case of this exhibition, it was very focused on illustrating these various themes, and we essentially came up with 4 different versions of this show, and came together to really talk about the overlaps. We had a lot of overlaps. Which artists we felt would be the best match for us in terms of inviting them to make new work. So in the case of this particular show, we were drawing on the experience and connections with artists that exist with 4 different curators. So it wasn't just me making a decision, but sort of helping navigate and negotiate 4 different voices around these ideas. So I think for each of us, we brought to the table our experience of looking at work that we felt both was important to be seen, might be under-recognized. These were some of the sort of the qualities we were looking for. And so you look at the list of artists, and there are a handful of names I hope you know, but there's also a lot of names I know you don't, because they just haven't been shown. But our travels literally from the farthest north you can land a plane to the farthest south you can travel in a boat, we were there. One of us were there. And there are so many artists working in places that curators so rarely visit. So part of what we were also looking for was work that really felt fresh to us.
We can take one final question.
One more? Okay. I think there's one down here.
fascinated by the inclusion of Juan Downey and this piece from the 70s. I'm wondering if you could just speak a bit more about it. In terms of how you understood it as maybe a guiding idea for the show, I don't know. In particular, this for me, it's interesting that his title is Trans Americas, which is obviously a different prefix than Pan.
That's right.
And also his emphasis on what at the time was really new media.
Sure, it was
video,
1973. The Porta-Pack was just out.
Yeah, was so important. And yeah, so I guess I'm just interested that you said there were other historical works, but that was the only one you showed. So yeah, just if there's any more.
Yeah, as the curator team came together, we kept bringing up these more historic touchstones. Juan Downey, we felt, was really under-recognized for this early work. Agnes Dennis, Wheatfield, is in our show. We spent a lot of time in her studio looking at images that no one has ever seen of her iconic piece, and digitized hundreds of those images in a slideshow in our show. Alan Sekula and his drives through Southern California. Annabella Geyer, an artist of the same generation from Brazil, who was reclaiming the continent at a very volatile time in South America. Florence Miller Pierce, who was making these extraordinary transcendental paintings in the West. So there's quite a few of these artists that are throughout the show that have a really, for us, a really interesting new dialogue with more recent works. So thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.